Before we start, where are you watching this from right now? Are you in bed? Is it dark outside yet? Because if it is, good. These stories were made for exactly this moment. I have been collecting stories. Not the polished kind with clean endings that let you sleep easy. The other kind. The kind someone whispers to you at 2 in the morning because they cannot say it out loud in the daylight. The kind that do not leave you when the telling stops. And here is the thing nobody warns you about. The most terrifying horror is never the monster at the door. It is the quiet thing. The thing that has been growing inside an ordinary life, in an ordinary neighborhood, behind an ordinary face. Patient. Watching. Waiting for one unremarkable evening to finally show itself. What if that evening was tonight? Before we begin, if these stories keep the lights on for you, hit that like button. Subscribe to Dr. Bonechill. We are pushing toward 1,000 subscribers and every one of you brings us closer. Drop a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if it is raining. Because in these stories, it always is. Now, let me take you somewhere that used to feel safe. Story 1, The Neighbor's Light. It started the way everything terrible starts. Quietly. I had lived on Alderman Street for 6 years. One of those neighborhoods where everything looks exactly the same. Same beige siding. Same 2-car driveways. Same porch lights that click on at dusk like the whole street is exhaling together. I knew my neighbors by sight, not by name. That suited me fine. I had always been more comfortable with silence than with people. My wife used to say that about me. She was not wrong about much. She had been gone 3 months by the time any of this began. Not dead. Just gone. Packed a bag on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work and left a note on the kitchen counter. 6 words. I cannot explain it. I'm sorry. I read that note so many times the paper went soft at the crease. I never could make sense of it. I still cannot. Grief does something to a person that nobody prepares you for. It does not just make you sad. It makes you strange. It pulls you inward, away from noise, away from people, away from anything that reminds you that the world is still turning even though something inside you has gone completely still. I stopped answering my phone. I ate whatever was left in the pantry. I sat by the living room window at night and watched the street because it was easier than thinking. Easier than remembering her voice or the way she folded laundry or the specific sound of her laughing at something on television in the other room. That was when I first noticed Gerald's light. The house directly across from mine belonged to a man named Gerald. I only knew his name because of the mailbox. Older man. Retired, I assumed. He kept a clean lawn and gave that tight, practiced wave whenever our eyes accidentally met across the street. The kind of wave that means nothing. The kind that says I acknowledge you exist but I do not intend to learn anything about you. I respected that about him, honestly. We understood each other without ever speaking. His bedroom window faced my living room window directly. And every night, without exception, at exactly 11:47, his bedroom light would switch on. I know the exact time because I started checking. It bothered me in a way I could not immediately explain. Not 11:45. Not midnight. 11:47, every single night, with a consistency that felt less like habit and more like intention. I told myself it was nothing. Old men wake at strange hours. Insomnia. A glass of water. The body doing what aging bodies do without asking permission. But then I noticed he was standing at the window, not looking out. That is the part that hooked something cold inside me. He was standing with his back to the glass, facing into the room, perfectly still, like he was waiting for something on the other side of that bedroom that I could not see. My brain did what brains do and immediately started building reasonable explanations. Sleepwalking. A nightly routine. Something completely ordinary that only looked strange from the outside at this particular angle in this particular light. I turned away from the window. I went to bed. I did not sleep. The next night I told myself I would not look. I lasted until 11:43. The light came on. Gerald was there. Back to the glass, same as before. And this time I noticed his hands. They were hanging at his sides, but his fingers were moving. Not trembling. Moving in that slow and deliberate way that fingers move when someone is silently counting. Or reciting something word by word that they do not want to let escape into the air. I started keeping a notebook. I know exactly how that sounds. I know it sounds like a man unraveling. But when you are living alone in a house that still smells faintly like someone else's shampoo, you reach for whatever gives the hours shape. Watching gave me a reason to stay awake. The notebook made the watching feel like something other than obsession. I recorded the time every night. How long he stood there. Whether his head moved. Whether any other light in his house was on. It was always only that one window. The rest of the house stayed dark. On the 14th night, he turned around. He turned slowly, the way you turn when you already know exactly what you are going to find. And he looked directly at my window. Not in the vague, unfocused way a person stares into the dark across a street. He looked at me with the kind of precision that means he had always known I was there. That every one of those 14 nights he had been standing with his back to the glass, he had known someone was watching him. And he had simply been deciding when to turn around. I stepped back from the window. My chest went tight. I pressed myself against the wall and stood there in the dark of my own living room like a child who believed that if he could not see the monster could not see him. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself grief had made me paranoid. I told myself 100 reasonable things in the space of about 30 seconds, and not one of them settled the cold that had moved into my stomach and was not moving out. I did not sleep at all that night. In the morning I made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and gave myself a quiet, firm talk about reality. About the fact that an old man looking out his window at night was not an event. It was not significant. I was a grieving person in an empty house who had started building meaning out of nothing because meaning, even dark meaning, was better than the blankness that came with loss. I felt better after that. Steadier. I set the notebook on the kitchen table and told myself I was done with it. That was when I noticed the paper on the floor by the front door. Not an envelope. Not a flyer. A single folded piece of plain white paper that had been slipped under the door sometime during the night. I stood in the hallway for a long moment before I picked it up. My hands were steady. I was proud of that later. I unfolded it and read the 6 words written there in careful, even handwriting. It is not grief. It is beginning. I stood in my hallway for a very long time. I thought about my wife's note. The one still sitting on the kitchen counter with its crease gone soft from handling. I cannot explain it. I'm sorry. 6 words. I walked to the counter and picked it up and held both notes side by side under the kitchen light. The handwriting was not the same, but the number of words was, and the feeling they left behind was identical. That specific, breathless feeling of being told something enormous by someone who already knew you were not ready to hear it. I looked out the kitchen window toward Gerald's house. His car was in the driveway. His lawn was as neat as always. His porch light was off in the bright morning like nothing had happened. I still have both notes. I keep them in the same drawer now. The paper on both has gone soft at the fold. I have not opened the curtains at night since. But I still hear it sometimes just at the edge of sleep when the rain gets loud against the glass. The sound of something patient. Something that turned around and found me watching and decided, after all that quiet waiting, that it was finally time to begin. I do not know what it wanted from Gerald. I am starting to understand what it wants from me. Story 2, The Voice Downstairs. I'm not a superstitious man. I want you to understand that before anything else. I do not believe in signs. I do not knock on wood or avoid black cats or check my horoscope on slow mornings. I am an accountant. I live inside numbers. Numbers do not lie, do not shift meaning depending on your mood, do not mean one thing on Monday and something else entirely by Thursday. I built my whole adult life around that kind of certainty. Which is exactly why what happened to me on Birchwood Lane destroyed me in a way that I am still not sure I have fully come back from. I moved into the house on Birchwood Lane in October. A rental. Nothing special. 2 stories, narrow staircase, kitchen that smelled faintly of someone else's cooking no matter how many times I cleaned it. The kind of house that has absorbed years of other people's lives and never quite lets go of them. My divorce had finalized 2 months before. The apartment I had been staying in felt too small for the silence I was carrying around, so I found the rental online, signed the lease on a Thursday, and moved in that weekend with 4 boxes and a mattress and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical tiredness but from spending too many months pretending to be fine. The neighborhood was quiet. Families mostly. Halloween decorations still up on half the porches. Kids on bikes in the afternoon. The kind of street where nothing unusual ever happens and everyone takes a certain quiet pride in that fact. The first night I slept well. Deeply actually. Better than I had in months. I remember thinking that maybe the house was exactly what I needed. Space. Quiet. Somewhere that held no memory of who I used to be before everything fell apart. The second night I heard the voice. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say voice because the word alone does not carry the right weight. It was not a voice the way your voice or my voice is a voice. It was lower than that. Slower. Like someone speaking underwater or like a recording played back at the wrong speed. The words stretched just far enough that you could almost make them out but not quite. Almost. That almost is what kept me lying there in the dark instead of getting up and doing something rational. Because part of me, some stubborn and exhausted part, kept believing that if I just listened for one more second I would understand it. That the words were right there on the edge of sense and patience would bring them into focus. It was coming from downstairs. I lay there for what felt like a long time. The house was a rental. Old houses make noise. Pipes. Settling foundations. The particular acoustics of rooms that have been empty and are now adjusting to the presence of a living body moving through them. I had read that somewhere once and I held on to it the way you hold on to anything reasonable when the unreasonable is pressing in from all sides. Then the voice stopped. Clean stop. No trailing off. Just present and then not present, like a switch thrown in a dark room. I got up. Turned on every light between the bedroom and the staircase. Walked downstairs slowly with my phone in my hand and the flashlight on even though the overhead lights were already burning. I checked the kitchen, the living room, the small bathroom off the hallway, the back door. Everything was locked. Everything was empty. The house was exactly as I had left it. I went back to bed. I told myself it was the neighborhood. Someone's television through a shared wall. Except it was not a shared wall house. It was fully detached. I knew that. I had checked specifically because I valued quiet. I told myself it was a dream fragment, that half-awake state where the mind manufactures sound and sensation that feel indistinguishable from the real thing. I had experienced that before. Everyone has. I was asleep again within 20 minutes. The third night it came back. Same time. Same quality of sound. That slow, submerged, almost language drifting up through the floor from somewhere below me. But this time I caught a word. Or something that my brain decided was a word, the way you see a shape in clouds and cannot unsee it once it is there. The word my brain assembled from the sound was mine. Just that. Mine. Drawn out and low and said with a patience that had no urgency in it whatsoever. Which was somehow worse than if it had been screaming. I sat up in bed and turned the lamp on and sat there with my knees pulled up and my back against the headboard like a man waiting out a storm. And I thought about my ex-wife. Not because she was relevant, but because grief finds its way into every dark moment whether you invite it or not. I thought about the way she used to say my name when she was disappointed in me. That specific quiet tone that carried more weight than shouting ever could. I thought about how the end of a marriage is not one moment but 1,000 small moments of not quite reaching each other until one day the distance becomes the relationship and you both stop pretending otherwise. The voice stopped. I did not move for a long time. In the morning I called my landlord. Practical man. South of 60, spoke in short sentences, had the energy of someone who had heard every possible tenant complaint and mentally filed most of them under not my problem. I told him I had been hearing sounds at night. A voice, possibly, coming from the lower level. I asked if there was a basement I had not been shown. There was a pause on the line that lasted just a beat too long. He said no. No basement. Slab foundation. Nothing under the house but earth. I thanked him and hung up. That afternoon I walked the perimeter of the house outside. I was not sure what I was looking for. Some kind of vent or access point. A crawl space door I had missed. I crouched along the foundation line and ran my hand along the concrete and found nothing. Just solid ground and dead October grass and the faint smell of rain coming in from the west. That night I set my phone on the nightstand with the voice recorder running before I fell asleep. I woke at the same time. The voice was there. I lay completely still and breathed and let it run. It lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds according to the timestamp. Then it stopped. I reached over without turning the lamp on and hit the stop button and lay in the dark and waited for my heart to slow down. In the morning I played it back. 4 minutes and 11 seconds of silence. Not white noise. Not the ambient hum of a house at rest. Silence. Complete and total, as if the microphone had simply stopped registering the world for that exact window of time. I played it 3 more times. Silence every time. I called my brother that evening. He lives 4 states away, but he is the kind of person who answers regardless of the hour, one of those rare people whose presence over a phone line feels substantial enough to actually help. I told him everything. The voice, the recording, the landlord's pause. He listened without interrupting, which is unusual for him. When I finished he was quiet for a moment and then he said, and I remember this exactly, "Are you sure it is the house making the sound? Are you sure it is not coming from you?" I told him that made no sense. He said he knew. He said to call him tomorrow. I did not call him tomorrow because by tomorrow everything had changed. That night the voice did not come at the usual time. I lay awake waiting for it past midnight, past 1, past 2. Nothing. The house was so quiet I could hear my own breathing and the distant sound of rain beginning on the roof. I finally let myself relax. I finally started to feel the pull of sleep. And then it spoke directly into my left ear. Not from downstairs. Not through the floor. From the pillow beside me. from the empty half of the bed where another person used to sleep. Low and slow and closer than anything had any right to be, and this time I did not almost understand it. This time I heard it completely and clearly and without any ambiguity at all. It said, "You already know what you did." I have not slept on that side of the bed since. I tell myself it is habit. I tell myself I simply prefer the other side now. But the truth is that every time I come close to the center of the mattress, something in me pulls back hard and certain, the way your hand pulls back from a flame before your mind has even registered the heat. I finished my lease 7 months later. I moved out on a Saturday morning in the rain. The new tenants moved in the following week. Young couple. I saw them once from my car as I drove past. They were carrying boxes in through the front door, laughing at something, the way people laugh when a new beginning still feels like exactly that. I almost stopped. I almost rolled down the window and said something. I did not know what I would have said. I still do not. Some things you cannot warn people about. Some things a person has to hear for themselves, in the dark, in the quiet, from the empty space beside them. Whether they are ready or not. Story 3. The Man Who Knew. I need to tell you something before I get into this. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. I stopped needing that a long time ago. Belief requires a witness, and by the time anything worth witnessing happened, I was always alone. That is the nature of these things, I have come to understand. Whatever this was, it did not perform for audiences. It was careful. It was patient. And it chose its moments with a precision that still makes the back of my neck go cold when I think about it too long. My name does not matter. What matters is Sycamore Drive, and the summer I spent there, and the man at number 41 who knew things he had absolutely no business knowing. I had taken a temporary position with a firm 2 states away from home. 3 months, possibly 4, depending on how the project ran. My company covered a furnished rental, and I found one on Sycamore Drive through an agency. Clean street. Old trees that met overhead in the middle and turned the whole road into something that felt almost like a tunnel in full summer leaf. The kind of neighborhood that looks like the establishing shot of a film where everything is about to go quietly wrong. The house was fine. Furnished simply, smelled of lemon cleaning product, had a back porch that caught the evening breeze nicely. I am a practical man by nature. I notice what is functional, and I do not spend much time on atmosphere. I set up my laptop on the kitchen table, bought groceries, learned which drawer the landlord had left the spare keys in and which burner on the stove ran hotter than its dial suggested. I settled in the way a man settles into a hotel room. Efficiently and without attachment. My neighbor at number 41 introduced himself the second morning. I was drinking coffee on the front step, and he came down his driveway in that unhurried way of someone with nowhere particular to be and all the time in the world to get there. Medium height. Older, maybe late 60s, with close-cropped white hair and the kind of tan you get from a life spent mostly outdoors. His name was Robert. He shook my hand with a firm, dry grip and smiled the way people smile when they already like you and are simply waiting for you to catch up. We spoke for maybe 10 minutes that first morning. Normal things. How long was I staying? What line of work? Did I find the neighborhood easily enough? He had the manner of a man who was genuinely interested in people without being intrusive about it. I liked him in that uncomplicated way you sometimes like a person you have just met. I went inside and poured more coffee and did not think about him again for several days. The second conversation changed things. It was a Thursday evening. I had just finished a long call with my project lead that had gone badly in the specific way that only work calls can go badly, where nothing is explicitly said but you hang up knowing something has shifted and not in your favor. I was standing on the back porch with a beer I was not really drinking when Robert appeared at the fence line between our yards. Not aggressively. Just present, the way he seemed to do things. He nodded at the beer and said it looked like a hard day. I said something non-committal. Fine maybe. Or just work stuff. He nodded slowly and then he said, and I remember this with complete clarity, the project issue is not your fault. The data they gave you in March was incomplete. You will be able to prove that by the end of next week. I stood very still. He said it the way you say something obvious. The way you say it looks like rain or the traffic is bad this time of day. Matter of fact. Unhurried. And then he said good night and went back inside his house before I had assembled enough of my thoughts to form a single question. I stood on that porch for a long time after the light in his kitchen went out. I told myself he had overheard part of my call through the open window. That was the only rational explanation. The window had been open. He was nearby. People catch fragments of conversations all the time, and sometimes those fragments land close enough to the truth to feel significant when they are really just coincidence sharpened by anxiety. I have a tendency to assign meaning to things when I am stressed. My therapist had said that to me once, and it had stayed with me the way useful observations do. I went inside. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the project files. The data from March was incomplete. Not in an obvious way. In a subtle, buried way that I had not caught because I had not known to look for it and frankly had not been looking closely enough. It was the kind of thing that would take several days to fully document and present in a way that would hold up. Several days or approximately 1 week. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a while. The following week I built the documentation and submitted it, and the situation with my project lead resolved itself almost immediately, exactly the way Robert had said it would. I told myself that was the end of it. That he had made a lucky guess or overheard more than I realized, or that the whole thing was a coincidence I had inflated because I was alone in an unfamiliar place and my mind was doing what minds do when they are insufficiently occupied. But I started paying attention to him after that. I could not help it. I tried not to make it obvious. I would be working at the kitchen table with a sight line to his front yard, and I would notice when he came and went, who stopped to talk to him, how long he spent on his porch in the evenings. He seemed unremarkable in every observable way. He gardened. He read on his porch. He waved at passing cars with that same unhurried ease. Nothing about him suggested anything other than a retired man living a quiet and orderly life. And then one evening he stopped at my front door. Knocked twice. I opened it and he stood there holding a small paper bag. He said his wife had baked too many rolls and he hated to waste them and he thought I might want them. I took the bag and thanked him, and he turned to go and then paused at the bottom of the porch steps. He said, without turning around, "You are going to get a call tomorrow morning. From home. Do not let it frighten you more than it needs to. She's going to be all right." He walked back to his house. I stood in the doorway holding the paper bag, and the bottom of my stomach was gone, and in its place was something cold and vertiginous, the specific feeling of the ground shifting under a thing you had decided was solid. My mother called the next morning at 7:14. She had been taken to the hospital the previous evening. A cardiac event. Minor, the doctors were saying. She was stable. She was going to be fine. She was going to be all right. I sat on the edge of the bed after that call, and I thought about Robert with a clarity and a fear that I had not let myself feel before that moment, because before that moment I had still been explaining him away. I could not explain him away anymore. The project data I could rationalize. The call from home I could not. He had no connection to my family. He did not know my mother existed. He had no access to any information that would have told him what was coming. And yet, I went to his door that afternoon. I knocked. I waited. I knocked again. No answer. His car was in the driveway. I could hear the television faintly through the front window. I knocked a third time, and then I felt suddenly and completely foolish, and I went home. He avoided me for 2 weeks after that. Not obviously. He was still present, still on his porch, still waving at passing cars. But whenever I came outside, he found a reason to go in. Whenever I moved toward the fence line, he was already turning away. I began to understand that this was intentional. That he had decided, for whatever reason, to stop. On my last day on Sycamore Drive, I was loading my car when he came outside. He walked straight to me this time, direct, no pretense of casual encounter. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not read, and then he said something that I have been trying to make sense of ever since. He said, "It is not that I know things. It is that some people make it impossible not to. You are going to understand that soon." I'm sorry for that. I asked him what he meant. I asked him clearly and directly what he meant by that. He shook my hand the way he had the first morning, that same firm, dry grip, and then he went back inside and closed the door, and I stood on the pavement next to my loaded car in the summer heat and felt the first edge of something I did not have a name for yet. I have a name for it now. I have had it for a while. I just do not say it out loud. Not yet. Not until I am sure. Here is story 4, a new protagonist, new neighborhood, new breed of dread. Story 4, the drawings. I used to think the worst thing a person could lose was someone they loved. I know better now. The worst thing a person can lose is the version of themselves that existed before they knew the truth. Because once that version is gone, you cannot go back to it. You cannot unknow what you know. You cannot unsee what you have seen. And you cannot look at your own child the same way after you have sat alone in the dark and genuinely wondered whether the thing sitting across the breakfast table from you every morning is entirely the child you raised. I need you to understand that I love my son. I need that to be the foundation of everything else I am about to tell you, because without that foundation the rest of it sounds like something else entirely. His name is Daniel. He was 7 years old when this began. He is 9 now, and he is fine. He is completely fine. I tell myself that every day, and most days I believe it. We lived on Pembroke Circle. One of those planned neighborhoods where every house is a variation on the same 3 designs and the lawns are maintained with a uniformity that suggests an unspoken but deeply felt community agreement about acceptable grass height. My wife Carla and I had moved there when Daniel was 4. Good school district. Safe streets. The kind of place you choose deliberately when you have a child and you want the word safe to mean something concrete. Daniel was a quiet kid. Not troubled quiet. Just interior. He spent a lot of time in his room, which was fine with us. He was not withdrawn in any social sense. He had friends at school, participated in class, laughed easily and often. But at home he seemed to have an inner life that was largely his own, and he did not feel the need to narrate it to us, which I respected. I was the same way as a child. I recognized it. He liked to draw. He had liked it since he could hold a crayon, and it had only deepened as he got older. By the time he was 6 he was drawing with a focus and a seriousness that surprised us. Not because the drawings were especially skilled, though they were detailed for his age, but because of the look on his face when he drew. That total absorption. That quality of being completely elsewhere. We bought him good paper. Real colored pencils, not the waxy cheap kind. A small wooden drawing board he could prop on his knees in bed. We encouraged it because it seemed healthy and because there are worse things for a quiet child to do with his interior life than fill pages with it. The drawings were normal at first. Houses and cars and superheroes and animals, the standard vocabulary of a young child's imagination. Then, sometime around his 7th birthday, they changed. I noticed it gradually. The way you notice something that shifts incrementally, each individual change too small to flag on its own, but the accumulation eventually crossing a threshold your brain cannot ignore. The drawings became more detailed, more specific. Still houses and streets, but now with a precision that felt less like imagination and more like documentation. Particular trees in particular positions. A specific crack in a specific pavement. A car parked at an exact angle in a driveway. I assumed it was a developmental thing. Children become more observational as they grow. They start drawing what they actually see rather than what they imagine. I mentioned it to Carla and she agreed, and we both filed it under the long and generally benign list of ways our child was growing up. Then I recognized one of the drawings. It was a Tuesday evening. Daniel had left a stack of his drawings on the kitchen table before dinner, and I was flipping through them idly while Carla finished cooking. Most of them I did not recognize, specific enough to feel real but not immediately placeable. And then I turned to one that stopped my hand completely. It was our neighbor's house. Not ours. The house belonging to the Hendersons at number 12, directly across the circle from us. Drawn with that same precise and patient detail. The specific way their rose bush grew slightly too wide for the trellis on the left side of the porch. The particular angle of their garage door that never quite closed flush and always left a thin wedge of darkness at the bottom right corner. The recycling bin that they always left out a day too long. All of it exactly right. I set the drawing down and picked up the next one. Another house on our street. Then another. Then one that took me longer to place and then placed itself with a lurch. It was a house 3 blocks over on a street I occasionally cut through on my way to the grocery store. A house Daniel had no reason to know existed. I called him into the kitchen. I kept my voice easy. I asked him about the drawings in the way you ask a child about something when you do not want them to know the question matters. He sat across from me and looked at the drawings with that same calm interior expression and said he drew what he saw. I asked him when he saw the house 3 blocks over. He looked at me then. Not evasively. Directly. With an openness that was somehow more unsettling than evasion would have been. He said he saw it at night sometimes. He said he saw lots of houses at night. I asked him what he meant by that. I asked if he meant in dreams. He thought about it for a moment with genuine seriousness, the way children are serious when they are trying to find the right words for something they understand but have not yet translated into language. Then he said, not exactly like dreams. More like I go there. Carla had turned from the stove. The kitchen was very quiet. I asked him gently as I have ever asked anything, where he went. What he saw when he got there. He picked up one of the drawings and looked at it and then looked back at me with those clear and steady eyes and said, mostly I just walk around. I look at things. Sometimes there are people but they cannot see me. It is like being made of something they cannot notice. He said it with no distress whatsoever. The way you describe a favorite route or a familiar game. Comfortable. Practiced. Like something he had been doing long enough that it no longer seemed remarkable. I kept my face neutral. I told him that was very interesting. I told him dinner was almost ready and he should go wash his hands. After he left the room, Carla and I looked at each other across the kitchen, and neither of us said anything because neither of us had words that were adequate to the moment. That night after Daniel was asleep, I went to his room and sat on the edge of his bed and watched him in the dark the way parents watch sleeping children, that particular quality of watching that is part love and part something more vigilant. He looked exactly like himself. Exactly like the child I had been putting to bed for 7 years. Soft breathing. One arm thrown over his stuffed dog. A face so familiar I knew every line of it. I picked up his drawing board from the nightstand. There was a new drawing on it, done before he fell asleep. A house I did not recognize. 2 stories, a covered porch, a light on in a second-floor window. And standing at that lit window, visible only as a pale outline, a figure. The figure appeared to be looking out, watching something below. I set the drawing board down carefully and went back to my own room and lay in the dark next to Carla, who was not sleeping either, and we did not speak about it that night or the next morning at breakfast or on the walk to school when Daniel held my hand and pointed at a passing dog and laughed at something only 7-year-olds find funny. We did not speak about it because speaking about it meant deciding what it was. And we were not ready for that. I'm still not entirely sure I am ready. But here is the thing that stays with me. Here is the part one circle back to in the quiet hours when the rain is loud on the roof and the house is dark and Daniel is asleep down the hall. 3 weeks after that conversation in the kitchen, I drove 3 blocks over to the house from the drawing. I found it easily. Exactly as drawn, down to the angle of the porch and the particular overhang of the oak tree on the left side of the yard. I parked across the street and sat in the car and looked at the second-floor window. There was a light on. I do not know what I expected to see. I do not know what I was hoping to prove or disprove. I sat there for several minutes in the early evening quiet with the engine off and the first drops of rain beginning to tap against the windshield. And then the figure appeared in the window. A person visible only as a silhouette, standing and looking out. Looking from where I was sitting in my exact direction. I started the car. I drove home. I did not take that route to the grocery store anymore. Daniel still draws. I still look at every drawing before I file it away. Most of them I recognize now. A few I do not, and those I fold carefully and put in a separate drawer that I have not decided what to do with yet. He is 9 now. He is fine. He is completely fine. I tell myself that every morning while I make his breakfast and watch him eat and remember how he described it that evening in the kitchen. His face open and earnest and completely at ease. Like being made of something they cannot notice. I think about that a lot. Especially at night. Especially in the rain. Story 5. The reflection. I will tell you exactly when I knew something was wrong with me. Not wrong like illness. Not wrong like grief or stress or the particular madness of a man who has been alone too long and started hearing things in the silence. Wrong in a way that has no clean medical word attached to it. Wrong in the way that a compass is wrong when something beneath the earth shifts and the needle stops pointing north and starts pointing at something else entirely. Something it was never designed to find. It was a Tuesday morning in November. I was standing at the bathroom mirror brushing my teeth. Ordinary as breathing. The kind of moment that exists in the gaps between real life, a moment your brain does not bother to record because there is nothing in it worth keeping. Except that morning my reflection was a half-second behind me. Not dramatically. Not like a horror film where the mirror version turns and grins while you stand there screaming. Nothing so theatrical. Just a half-second. A barely perceptible lag, the kind of thing you would dismiss instantly and completely if it happened once and never again. I stopped moving. My reflection stopped moving. Synchronized again, immediate, perfect. I stared at my own face for a long moment and then I rinsed my mouth and went to work and did not think about it again for 3 days. My name is Marcus. I am 34 years old. I live on a street called Garrison Row in a brick semi-detached house that I bought 2 years ago when the company I work for went public and briefly made me feel like a man with a future he could afford. The neighborhood is old in the way English neighborhoods are old. Terraced houses with small front gardens and bins that come out on Thursdays and a corner shop run by a family who knows every regular customer by order rather than name. The large flat white no sugar. That is me. Has been for 4 years. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand how anchored I was. How ordinary. How completely and deliberately I had constructed a life with no room in it for anything that could not be explained in plain language. The reflection happened again on the Friday. This time I was ready for it. Or I thought I was. I had spent 3 days half convincing myself it had not happened and half preparing myself for the possibility that it had. I stood at the bathroom mirror in the morning light and I moved my right hand slowly to one side and watched. My reflection moved with me. Perfect synchrony. I stood there for a full minute, moving slowly, watching, and nothing was wrong and I felt the specific embarrassment of a man who has frightened himself over nothing. I turned to leave. In the mirror my reflection turned a second later. I stood with my back to the mirror and did not move. My heart was doing something loud and irregular that I was aware of in a detached, almost academic way, as if it belonged to someone else and I was simply monitoring it from a distance. I counted to 10. I turned back around. My reflection was facing forward, looking at me. Correct. Normal. Waiting. I went to work. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop and stared at the screen and did not read a single word on it for 40 minutes. I called my friend Joel that evening. Joel is the kind of friend who has known you long enough that you do not have to build up to things. I told him what I had seen. Both times. He was quiet for a moment and then he said what any reasonable person would say. He said I was tired. He said I had been working too hard. He said the brain does extraordinary things when it is running on insufficient sleep and too much screen time and not enough of anything that actually matters. He said all of this with complete sincerity and I knew he was right, and I also knew, with a certainty that sat in my chest like a stone, that he was wrong. I covered the bathroom mirror that night. A towel draped over the top of the frame. I told myself it was temporary. Just until I had slept properly. Just until the rational explanation presented itself the way rational explanations always eventually do if you give them enough room. I slept well. Better than I had in weeks, actually. Deep and dreamless and long. I woke feeling rested in a way that felt almost suspicious, like the sleep itself was trying to tell me something was fine so that I would lower my guard. I left the towel over the mirror. A week passed. Then another. I used the mirror at work to shave. I avoided my reflection in shop windows with the casual deliberateness of someone who has decided they simply do not like looking at themselves, which is common enough that nobody notices. I told myself the bathroom mirror was a specific thing, a contained anomaly, and that as long as I did not engage with it the situation would remain contained. Then my colleague Priya stopped me in the corridor at work and asked if I was feeling all right. I said yes, fine, why? She looked at me with an expression I could not immediately categorize. Concerned, yes, but underneath the concern something more uncertain. She said she had been trying to get my attention for the last 5 minutes. She said she had been standing directly in my eye line and I had looked right at her, directly at her, multiple times without any indication of seeing her at all. I told her I had been distracted, lost in thought. She accepted that. She is a kind person and kind people generally accept the explanations that cause the least disruption. But she looked back at me once as she walked away and the expression on her face in that backward glance was not entirely convinced. I went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and looked into the mirror above it. My reflection looked back at me immediately, correctly, no lag, no delay. I stared at it for a long time. My own face, the face I had been living behind for 34 years, looked the same. It looked completely the same. But I had the sudden and overwhelming feeling, the kind of feeling that arrives not as a thought but as a physical certainty in the body, that what was looking back at me from that mirror had been doing so for a very long time before I started paying attention to it. That it had been present and patient and watching from the other side of every reflective surface I had ever passed in my entire life. Every shop window, every phone screen, every still puddle on a wet street. Watching, learning, practicing. I gripped the edge of the sink and breathed slowly and looked at my own eyes in the mirror and asked myself, silently, with complete seriousness, a question I have not been able to stop asking since. How much of what I do every day is mine? How much of what I say, what I choose, what I reach for, and what I turn away from, how much of that originates with me and how much of it is something else? Something that has been shadowing me so precisely and for so long that the difference between us has become impossible to measure from the inside. I went home that evening and took the towel off the bathroom mirror. I stood in front of it for a long time. My reflection stood in front of me. We watched each other. It did not lag. It did not hesitate. It moved when I moved and stopped when I stopped and breathed when I breathed, and there was nothing I could point to and say there, that is the thing that is wrong. But I raised my left hand slowly, and I watched, and I have been watching ever since. I do not know what I am waiting for. A slip. A moment of imperfect synchrony. A half second where it forgets to follow. Or maybe I am waiting for something else entirely. Maybe I am waiting for the moment it decides it no longer needs to pretend. The mirror is still uncovered. I still stand in front of it every morning. I still go to work and drink my large flat white no sugar and sit at my desk and answer emails and speak to colleagues and live what looks, from the outside, like an entirely ordinary life on an entirely ordinary street. But sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, I lose track of who started it. And the rain keeps falling. And the reflection keeps watching. And I have stopped being sure which one of us is doing the looking. Story 6. The Appointments. I am a methodical person. I want that established clearly before anything else, because what I am about to describe will sound like the opposite of methodical, and I need you to understand that the contrast is exactly what made it so unbearable. I am the kind of man who color codes his calendar, who sets 3 alarms instead of 1, not because he doubts the first but because the margin of error is unacceptable, who keeps a running list in a small notebook of everything that needs doing, crossed off in pen when complete, never pencil, because pencil implies the possibility of undoing something that is already done. I am a methodical person, and I started losing time. Not dramatically at first. Nothing is ever dramatic at first. That is the thing nobody tells you about the way your life comes apart. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with noise and spectacle. It slips in through the ordinary, through the unremarkable, through the moments so small and forgettable that by the time you notice the pattern they have already been happening long enough to mean something you are not prepared for. My name is Thomas. I lived on Callaway Street for 2 years. A quiet road in a quiet part of a mid-sized city that prided itself on the kind of civic ordinariness that reassures people who have chosen stability over everything else. I was 38. I worked in insurance, which is a profession that exists entirely to anticipate catastrophe and price it accurately, which meant I spent my days thinking about every possible way a life could go wrong. I was good at my job. I understood risk in a way that most people do not, because most people believe, on some fundamental and irrational level, that catastrophe happens to others. I no longer believe that. The first appointment I did not remember making was on a Wednesday in early March. I found it in my calendar at 6 in the morning when I was reviewing the day the way I always did over my first coffee. 11 o'clock. An address on a street called Alderton Place that I did not recognize. No name attached. No description of what the appointment was for. Just the time and the address, entered in my calendar in my own handwriting on the Notes app, one used for everything, protected by my own passcode, on my own phone that had not left my possession. I stared at it for a long time. I assumed I had entered it half asleep. It had happened before, rarely, but it had happened. I assumed it was something work-related that I had logged without the context and then forgotten. I called my assistant Sarah and asked if she knew anything about an 11 o'clock on Alderton Place. She checked her own records and said no, nothing from her end, and asked if I wanted her to look into it. I said no. I canceled the appointment and crossed it out in the notebook and moved on with the day. 3 days later there was another one. Different address. Different time. Same absence of any information beyond those 2 bare facts. Time and location. No name. No purpose. Nothing that told me why I would have needed to be there or what I had expected to find when I arrived. I sat with this one longer. I turned the phone over in my hands and looked at the entry and tried to access whatever memory had produced it, the way you press on a bruise to establish its borders. Nothing. A complete and total absence of recollection. Not the hazy half-memory of something logged in exhaustion, but genuine blankness. A hole where a memory should have been. I canceled it. I said nothing to anyone. The third one I kept. I do not know exactly why. Partly because by the third one the pattern was undeniable, and ignoring a pattern goes against everything I am built for. Partly because the address this time was only 4 streets from my house, close enough that not going felt like a choice I would regret. And partly, if I am being completely honest, because some part of me that operates below the level of reason had already decided it needed to know. The address was a coffee shop. Small, independent, the kind with mismatched furniture and a chalkboard menu and staff who remember regulars without being asked. I arrived at 11 and stood outside for a moment and felt the specific absurdity of a grown man who had made an appointment with himself at a location he could not remember choosing for a purpose he could not identify. I went inside. I ordered coffee. I took a seat at a table near the window where I could see both the door and the street outside, and I waited with the particular quality of alertness that sits just below the threshold of obvious anxiety. At 11:17 a man sat down across from me. I had not seen him come in. That is the part one cannot account for no matter how many times I replay it. I was watching the door. I was watching the room. And then I looked across the table and he was simply there, the way a word is simply there when you finally find it, as if it had always been present and the finding was just a matter of timing. He was around my age. Unremarkable in appearance. The kind of face that is difficult to describe afterward, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because there was nothing that snagged on memory. Medium everything. He was holding a coffee cup and he looked at me with an expression of complete unsurprise and said, "You came." I asked him who he was. He said that was a reasonable question, and then he did not answer it. He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at me steadily and said, "How far back does it go?" I asked him what he meant. He said, "The appointments." "How far back do they go in your calendar? Have you checked?" I had not checked. It had not occurred to me to check backward. I had been so focused on the current entries that I had not thought to look at what might be behind them. I took my phone out and opened the calendar and scrolled back. 1 week, 2 weeks, a month. The entries were there. Every few days. Always the same format. Time and address and nothing else. I scrolled back further. 2 months. 3. The entries went back 11 months. I looked up from the phone and he was watching me with that same steady expression, and I had the cold and absolute certainty that he already knew what I had found because he had been waiting for exactly this moment and had known it was coming with the kind of patience that implies a very long familiarity with what he was waiting for. I asked him how long he had known about me. He said, "I found my first one 14 months ago. I did what you did. I canceled it. Then I canceled the next one. Then I kept the third one." I asked him where his third one had been. He said, "A coffee shop. 4 streets from my house." The room was very quiet. Outside the window the street went about its ordinary business, cars and pedestrians and the particular gray light of a city morning that has decided not to commit to any weather in particular. I looked at this man across a table in a coffee shop that I had apparently been scheduling appointments with myself to visit for 11 months without any conscious knowledge of doing so, and I understood that the question of who he was had been the wrong question entirely. The right question was what we both were. I asked it. He looked down at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he said, "I think we go places we are not aware of going. I think we do things we are not aware of doing. And I think whatever is responsible for that has been very careful up until now to make sure we do not compare notes." I thought about the 11 months of entries. The careful, consistent format. The fact that not once in 11 months had I noticed a single one until 3 weeks ago when something shifted and they became visible to me, or I became visible to them, or both. I asked him what changed. Why now? He said he did not know. He said he had been trying to work that out since his own third appointment when another man had sat down across from him in a coffee shop 4 streets from his house and shown him 11 months of calendar entries. The floor of the world shifted very slightly under me. I asked him who that man was. He said, "I do not know." When I looked back across the table he was gone. The same way I was apparently gone when you looked up at the door and then found me here. We sat together for another hour. We compared notes in the specific, careful way of 2 methodical people who have stumbled into something that resists methodology but refuse to abandon their tools just because the territory is strange. We found 12 addresses in common across our 2 sets of entries. 12 places we had both apparently been sending ourselves, separately, on different days, without the knowledge of either. We went to the first address on the list that afternoon. It was a house on a residential street 3 miles from where we were sitting. Ordinary house. Net curtains. A small ceramic plaque beside the door with a house number and a climbing rose that had been cut back for winter. We stood on the pavement outside it and looked at it, and neither of us moved toward the door. After a long time he said, "I do not think we are supposed to knock." I asked him why not. He said, "Because I think whatever has been sending us places has been very deliberate about what it shows us and what it does not. And I think the house is in the second category." We stood there for another few minutes in the beginning of what was becoming rain. Then we exchanged numbers and walked back to our respective cars and drove to our respective homes on our respective ordinary streets, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time looking at my phone. He texted me that evening. Just 2 lines. I checked my calendar. New entry for tomorrow. Different address this time. I checked mine. Same address. Same time. I have not decided yet whether I am going to keep it. I tell myself the decision is mine to make. I tell myself that a man who color codes his calendar and crosses things out in pen and understands risk in a way that most people do not is capable of making a clear and rational choice about whether to walk toward something or away from it. But here is what I know about risk after a career spent pricing it. The most dangerous kind is not the kind you can see and measure and prepare for. It is the kind that has already been happening, long before you thought to look. Story 7. The Woman Next Door. I want to tell you about kindness first, because this story starts with kindness, and I think that matters. I think it matters that the thing which undid me did not arrive wearing a threatening face. It did not arrive cold or cruel or with any of the signals we are taught from childhood to recognize as danger. It arrived warm. It arrived gentle. It arrived in the form of a woman who brought soup when I was sick and remembered how I took my coffee and laughed at the right moments in a conversation and made me feel, for the first time in a very long time, like I was visible to another person in a way that was entirely good. I want you to understand that before anything else, because what came after is easier to tell if you understand what came before it. My name is Aaron. I moved to Whitfield Terrace in the spring after a year that had taken more from me than I have words to properly account for. My father had died in January. My job had ended in March, not dramatically, just the quiet economic violence of a restructure that removed my position along with 11 others and sent us all home with boxes and severance packages and the specific kind of smile that corporations wear when they are doing something they know is wrong but have decided is necessary. My apartment lease had ended in April, and rather than renew it in a city that had started to feel like a place things ended rather than began, I had found a rental on Whitfield Terrace in a smaller city 2 hours north and moved there with the particular mixture of relief and terror that comes with dismantling a life and not yet knowing what you are building in its place. The house was the middle unit of a Victorian terrace. High ceilings. Original fireplaces that had been sealed over but were still visible. A small garden at the back that had been left to its own devices long enough to become entirely its own. I liked it. I liked the ceilings and the fireplaces and even the garden with its aggressive independence. It felt like a house that had survived things and was not bothered about advertising the fact. My neighbor on the left side was a woman named Claire. I met her the first week. She knocked on the shared wall with what I initially thought was a pipe problem and turned out to be a deliberate and cheerful knock of greeting, 3 raps, pause, 2 raps, which she later told me was something she did with all new neighbors because she believed the first week in a new place was the loneliest week and she liked to disrupt it. I opened the front door and she was standing on the pavement between our 2 doors with a bottle of wine and an expression of such uncomplicated friendliness that I laughed before I said anything. She laughed too. We drank the wine on my front step that evening and talked for 2 hours, and I went to bed feeling lighter than I had in months. She was a few years older than me. Worked from home doing something with data that she described with a self-deprecating vagueness that suggested she could explain it precisely, but had learned that most people preferred the vague version. She had lived on Whitfield Terrace for 4 years. She knew the neighbors, the good coffee, the market that ran on Saturday mornings 3 streets over. She shared this information with a generosity that had no performance in it. It was simply how she was, or how she seemed. We fell into an easy rhythm over the following weeks. Coffee in the mornings sometimes, both of us working from home, a knock on the wall that had become our shorthand for "Are you available?" Occasional evenings. Long conversations of the kind that are only possible when 2 people are both at a point in their lives where they have stopped pretending to be simpler than they are. She asked good questions and listened to the answers with a quality of attention that I had forgotten existed in the world and had started to believe I had invented in memory. I was not lonely anymore. That was the thing. For the first time in a year I was genuinely not lonely, and I had forgotten how much space that particular absence had been taking up until it was filled. The first strange thing was small enough that I almost did not register it. We were talking one evening in her kitchen, which was the mirror image of mine through the shared wall, same layout, same proportions, just reversed. She was telling me something about her childhood, a story I had asked about, and midway through a sentence she stopped. Not trailing off. A clean stop, like a recording paused. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not read, and then the expression cleared and she continued the sentence from exactly where she had stopped, word perfect, no acknowledgement of the pause. I did not say anything. I noted it the way you note something that does not quite make sense and file it under insufficient data pending further information. There was more information soon enough. A week later I mentioned something I had told her early in our friendship. A detail about my father, something specific about the last conversation we had before he died, something I had shared during one of those late evenings when the wine and the darkness made honesty feel less costly than it does in daylight. I mentioned it in passing, referencing something she had said at the time in response, and she looked at me with a small and genuine frown and said she did not remember me telling her that. I thought I had misremembered which friend I had told. It was possible. I had been speaking to more people since moving to Whitfield Terrace, deliberately, as part of what I was privately calling my reconstruction. I let it go, but then it happened again. A different detail. Something else I was certain I had told her, a conversation I could place specifically in time and weather and which cup I had been drinking from, and again she had no memory of it. She was not uncomfortable about it. She was not defensive. She simply did not remember and said so with the open honesty that was characteristic of her in everything else. I started paying closer attention. I began to notice that our conversations, while always warm and engaging and genuinely nourishing in the way they had always been, seemed to cover the same ground with a regularity that I had not registered before I started looking for it. Not identically, not scripted, but thematically circular in a way that meant we returned again and again to the same areas of my life. My father, my job, my sense of identity before the year that had taken so much. The questions were always slightly different. The approach always varied enough to feel natural. But the territory was consistent. She was always interested in the same parts of me. I lay awake one night and went through our months of friendship in my mind with the systematic attention of someone auditing an account they have begun to doubt. I went conversation by conversation as far back as I could access clearly. And what I found, or what I thought I found, in the small hours with the rain on the window and the particular honesty that comes when there is no one else in the room to perform sanity for, was that in all of those conversations, in all of those evenings and mornings and long exchanges that had made me feel known and visible and less alone, she had told me very little about herself. I knew the outline. The data work, the 4 years on the street, the Saturday market, the childhood story she had stopped midway through and resumed without acknowledging the stop. I knew her coffee order and her opinions on films and the particular laugh she had for things she found genuinely funny as opposed to merely polite. But I did not know her. Not the way she knew me. I got up and went to the kitchen and drank water and stood at the window looking out at the dark street and tried to talk myself down from where my mind was going. Because where it was going was somewhere I did not want to arrive. Somewhere that, if I arrived, I could not leave without taking everything I had rebuilt in the months on Whitfield Terrace and examining it in a light that might dissolve it entirely. But I could not stop the question once it had fully formed. What if she had not been forgetting the things I had told her? What if she had been resetting? I knocked on the wall the next morning. The usual knock. 3 raps, pause, 2 raps. She knocked back immediately, warmly, the way she always did. I went around and she opened the door before I knocked, which she often did, and handed me a coffee made exactly the way I took it, which she always remembered, and smiled with that uncomplicated and genuine warmth that had been the first thing I had trusted about her. I looked at her and I thought about all the things I knew about myself that she also knew. The grief, the job, the identity I was trying to rebuild, the specific vulnerabilities of a man in the middle of putting himself back together. All of it shared willingly, gratefully, because she had made it feel safe to share and because I had needed someone to share it with. I thought about what a person could do with that knowledge. What a careful and patient person could do with that precise and detailed map of another person's interior. I smiled back and drank the coffee and stayed for an hour and talked about ordinary things and laughed at the right moments and felt, the entire time, the sensation of standing on ice that I could not yet confirm was thin. I moved out of Whitfield Terrace 4 months later. I told her it was work. A new opportunity. A city I had always meant to live in. I said it warmly and she received it warmly, and we had a last evening with wine on the front step, and it was exactly like the first evening, and I could not find a single thing to point at and say that is wrong, that is the thing that proves it, that is evidence. I had no evidence. I still do not. What I had was a feeling that had taken up permanent residence somewhere below my sternum. Not dread exactly. Something quieter than dread. Something more like the feeling of reading a contract and knowing, without being able to articulate why, that there is something in it you have not found yet. I think about her sometimes. I think about the way she listened. The quality of that attention, so rare and so nourishing that I had walked toward it without looking at what it might have been for. I think about the things I told her in the dark on those late evenings. The things about my father. The things about who I was before that year took everything and who I was trying to become in the aftermath. I think about what it means to be known. And whether being known and being understood are actually the same thing. Or whether one of them, in the wrong hands, is simply the other one inverted. I have not let anyone make my coffee the way I take it since. I know how that sounds. I also know that knowing how that sounds has not changed it. The rain was falling the evening I drove away from Whitfield Terrace for the last time. I watched the terrace recede in the rearview mirror until the road turned and it disappeared. I did not look for her in the window. I was afraid of what I might see. I was more afraid of what I might not. That is story 7. And if you have made it this far, through all 7 stories, through all 7 ordinary streets and all 7 ordinary lives that quietly came apart at the seams, then you already know that Dr. Bonechill is not just a channel. It is a place for people who understand that the most frightening thing in the world is not the darkness outside. It is the moment the darkness becomes familiar. If these stories stayed with you, hit the like button. Subscribe if you have not already. We are building something here and every one of you is part of it. Leave a comment. Tell me which story felt the most real. Tell me which one you are still thinking about. Tell me if you are still watching from a dark room. Because if you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Stay unsettled. Stay with us. This is Dr. Bonechill. And the rain is not stopping anytime soon.